We're going to talk about it. We'll talk about it. It's going to take me a little while to get there, though. Surprise, surprise. All right, and so there's a few things that I kind of mentioned before. I wanna grab. Oh, sorry. Jeremiah, come here. Take this to your mother.
It's the benefit of having the lights off.
I'm gonna here. Just while the next place we're gonna go is 1 Corinthians chapter 15. All right, go ahead, Becky.
I was just wondering if this is how, like, stories of dragons started. You know how they're always
I think so.
Kind of evil and smarter and.
Yep. Well, and you look the concept again. We're going to talk about this a little bit, but like in Egyptian, like so inside you have the pyramids. Inside the pyramids, there's inscriptions that are supposed to guide the pharaoh through the afterlife. In those inscriptions, there's warnings against a being who is a winged serpent who will try to deceive the pharaoh. And you look at, even in the ancient Americas, the idea of the Quetzalcoatl, the winged world serpent. Like this idea of a winged serpent goes right back to the beginnings of humanity and a warning to be wary of the winged serpent. And so we're going to talk about it more when we get to Genesis chapter 6. But there's elements of mythology that we see in all of the family trees of the ancient world that have some sort of element in actual historical event. So the thing of the fall that we're coming to, like that historical event of the fall makes its way into the mythological systems of all the different people groups of the world. And the idea of the winged serpent is everywhere. And I think because, again, it originates back here. I read this section of 1 Corinthians a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the different types of life and changing our perspective of life to being relational and not like component. And it's in 1 Corinthians 15, again, Paul is talking about the resurrection. And he's talking about Jesus having a body in the resurrection. And in verses 42 and following, like Paul, he makes a statement, and it seems very weird in the light of the way that we understand things, but he says, "So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. If there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body." Like, for Paul, the idea that a spiritual thing is a physical thing is not a problem because it's a natural correlation in his mind that physical things have a body that's one way and spiritual things have a body that's another way. Like, for him, a spiritual being having a body is part of his natural reasoning. He's saying, yeah, of course that makes sense. Why do you guys have a problem with Jesus having a body after his resurrection? Spiritual things have body. There's a reference in the New Testament that I should have found it, but it's a throwaway line, but it talks about the Israelites in the wilderness and them eating the manna, and it says that the manna was the food of angels. Like, that cultural assumption was that angels eat. In fact, every time we see an angelic being in Scripture, it has a physical representation. And I mentioned this verse the other day, and I said it causes me all this trouble. But it's in Psalm 104. It's quoted in Hebrews as a reference to angels, and it's where it says that God makes his messengers winds and his ministers a flaming fire. And again, in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, that is quoted as being a reference to angels. And that's often the verse that's quoted when people are putting emphasis on angels as spirits. But even when we think it's that thinking doesn't even really work well with this, because this idea of wind and fire, they're still part of the physical universe. And we recognize, and cultures have recognized, that there's something different about wind and fire. You can't see the wind, but you see the effects of the wind, that kind of stuff. And so there's an association with the angelic things with wind and fire. But wind and fire is still part of the natural world. And I think sometimes we get stuck, and it's an aspect of total depravity, that for us, we divide everything up into the things that we can perceive and the things we can't perceive. But the Scripture doesn't actually do it that way. It's this idea here, this word for living creature, this includes angels. This includes the cherubim. The Bible breaks everything up into God and everything that's not God. And our idea of we have natural and supernatural, but from the perspective of Scripture and the perspective of creation, the only thing that's supernatural is God. Everything else is natural. Everything else is what He's created. Everything else is this word here, che, I believe it is, for living creatures. And so the serpent, Satan, he falls into this category of everything that's not God, everything God created. And him having a physical form that can in some ways be perceived, in some ways not being perceived, is not a problem from the perspective of Scripture. That's just the way things are. He's like the wind. He's like fire. He's there, but you can't see it and touch it and interact with it the same way you do everything else. And we recognize that as being part of the natural order of things, okay? Like, we think about what we can see. What we see through the electromagnetic spectrum, the visible light is a very small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum right in the middle. But you got microwaves and radio waves on one side, and you got ultraviolet light and X-rays and gamma rays on the other side that our human eye can't interact with, but still exist. That's why we get sunburns and all this kind of stuff. And there's animals that can see ultraviolet light. And there's animals that can see infrared light because their eyes are designed that way, but ours are not. Even sound. There are frequencies of sound that dogs can hear that people can't. But just because we as human beings can't perceive it doesn't mean it's not real. Doesn't mean it's a physical reality. It's just outside of our perception. And this is a thing I do with my kids at school. So cup your hands like this in front of you. Okay? Right now, you are holding in your hands a quintillionth of a gram of dark matter that you have no physical means of perceiving. But the way that we understand modern physics says is there and is part of the reality that holds our universe together. Okay? There's a lot of stuff out there that we as human beings can't perceive that is still a part of this physical reality that's not God. That's part of what He created. And it's just because of our self-centered, total depraved nature that we feel, well, if I can't see it, I don't believe it. But the Bible recognizes the fact that there's things that are out there that are like wind, that are like fire, that we can interact with, but we can't perceive them the same way we perceive other things. And the angelic beings are part of that reality. But that reality is still created by God. And it's still less than God, and is still part of that creation. And we, here in this text, are looking at an interaction between Adam and Eve and that part of reality that is not as quite perceived. Where we know they're interacting with an angelic being. And I just think these are things that are more confirming that idea. And that what we're talking about here is not Satan in the form of a serpent or Satan possessing a serpent, but it's Satan in his created form as a seraph, as this being that is perceived as a winged serpent who is a burning one and later a deceiver. Is the mic back there? So we'll go my wife, and then Jeremiah, can you bring the mic up to Chris? All right, go.
Yeah, just wonder if you could talk about like UFOs and extraterrestrial
No,
life.
I don't want to. I think
Later, you can talk about it later.
when we get to Genesis 6, I'll talk about UFOs and aliens and stuff when we get to Genesis chapter 6. So I don't know if you guys knew this, but during all the tug and war of the stimulus package, one of the things that happened was, I think it was Marco Rubio, as a Republican, he snuck into the stimulus package a provision that would require the Pentagon to make an official report to Congress about military in experiences with unidentified flying objects. And they have until the end of June to put it out. Now, some preliminary stuff has come out that indicates that the report is going to say that we have no reason to believe that these UFOs are aliens. And that's going to be the party line, which I agree with personally. We'll talk about it when we get to Genesis chapter 6. But it's one of those things that I feel like C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a famous guy. I like him. I have problems with some of his theology, but I like him. One of his most famous books is the Screwtape Letters. He hated writing the Screwtape Letters. I found it to be incredibly boring, but I read it when I was young. I might like it better now. And one of the reasons why C.S. Lewis did not like writing the Screwtape Letters is because of the research that he did to be able to write it. And he did a lot of research into the occult. And people asked him about it. He says, I'm not going to tell you. Say, I don't want people to learn the things that I learned about the occult. He's like, it's dangerous, it's unhealthy, it was bad for me, I didn't like it, I didn't like writing it. I'm glad you found it to be beneficial, but I wouldn't repeat the process. And so it's one of those things where it's like, I don't, personally in my own life, as I'm trying to figure out, like, what are the things that are important? What does God want me to invest my time in so that I can then teach it to other people? I don't really want to get into the occult a whole lot, but there is a lot of evidence that support a connection between people who put a lot of time and effort and study into UFOs and other occult stuff. So if you ask Josh, do you believe that there is intelligent life out there in the universe that is not a human being? Absolutely, I do. I believe it's a big universe, and I believe it's very self-centered for us to think that we are the only intelligent beings out there that God made. Yes. Well, but I think God, I think angels are made in God's image too. So I think the other things out there could be made in God's image. It doesn't have to just be us. Or it could. There's not a lot of information in the Old Testament about that for me to be able to come down on it hard. But I don't think any of them have visited our planet. Now, do I believe in UFOs? Sure. I think UFOs having some sort of occult or demonic connection is a more reasonable explanation for them than they are visitors from other planets. But I also believe there's more reasonable explanations, in my own opinion, than that. So we'll talk about it, because usually when you have theologians that are talking about aliens, it's almost always in the context of the Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6. So we'll talk about it when we get there. Okay? But if you have done study in occult stuff, and you look at how alien races are divided up, there are the reptilians. And so that often is connected with this. But I think the reason why you have this idea of these reptile beings that exist outside of the creative order that are somehow in the realm of the gods is because of the seraphim and because of this historical event of the fall. No, I think when he was sitting there talking to Eve, as we know it right here, he was doing so as a seraphim, which has the appearance of a winged serpentine being. Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk about that too. Yeah, because Lionel brought it up. Yeah, and I think the reason why serpents are called serpents and have a reputation as deceivers and diviners is because of the physical resemblance that they share with seraphim, of which Satan was one, and had this conversation. And if you're consistent, did the battery die? Let me see. If you're consistent with your, it might.
Hello.
That wouldn't make sense. Yeah, I don't know. I made the case a while ago that the seraphim, the cherubim, and the living creatures of Revelation 4 were all the same thing. I've changed my mind. I don't know what I believe about this. I have to do some more study on cherubim. We'll get there when we talk about Ezekiel. I'll try to be done by then. But I think there's something going on here. And I think it connects with a lot of stuff that we see within the ancient human consciousness. Why do we have winged serpents all over the place? Why do we have this identification between Satan and serpents and all that kind of stuff? Because I think we're looking at a seraphim right here who shows up in the garden, who Adam and Eve were familiar with, and started having this conversation. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
I guess 2 points.
Yeah.
The first one, going back to creation,
Yeah.
I do see 3 options of when they could be created.
When angels could be created?
Seraphim, angels,
Yeah, okay.
this category. My opinion is the first day of creation because they sang out. I wonder, after what you just said, if it could be the 6th when the animals were created.
I think it.
I think you prefer before all that.
I know. So in Psalms, it puts him making his angels like winds and ministers like a flaming fire, really early, before even the physical earth was formed. And Job says that when God formed the physical earth, the sons of God shouted for joy. So I would say the angels had to be really early.
That's why I think
Yeah.
the first day.
Yep. I think it says the other thing is the Bible doesn't actually talk about, like, when did God make the heavenly temple?
Right. Or could we have different categories of angels? We have different names of them in Scripture.
Yes. Yeah. Well, even said angels is a bad term. And it's even backwards because the word angel, the English word angel comes from the Greek word angelos, which is the normal everyday Greek word for messenger. And the reason why we refer to angels in the New Testament as angels is because they're God's messengers. And they didn't want to translate it with the English word messenger, so they just took angelos and transliterated it into angel. And then that got backtracked into English translations of the Old Testament. So whenever we saw these angelic beings, we used the English word angel that came from the Greek word angelos, that came from the Greek language, which didn't even exist back when all this stuff was happening and being written. So, angel, I think we need to understand angel as being an umbrella word, that anything that is that creation that primarily exists in the heavenly realms with God, and that God uses to interact with the earthly realms. And we'll talk more about it as we kind of go through. And I think the New Testament angel is almost what like the Old Testament cherubim is. Where cherub, apparently, this is what I'm learning, is actually just the normal ancient word for a throne guardian. So if you had the king and you were the guard, you guarded the king at the throne, you were a cherub. And so cherubim is an umbrella term for all the angelic beings that serve God around his throne. And so seraphim would be also cherubim. And so seraphim would be like what is describing their physical form, and cherubim would be describing what is their job. But I think that there are angelic beings that are not seraphim. But then they would be maybe, I'll try to study it some more so that when we get to Ezekiel and the cherub, well, actually, there's going to be a cherub that shows up before we even get done with Genesis chapter 1. But I'll try to have a better understanding of it when we get there. Go ahead, Chris.
Going back to matter that exists that we cannot perceive.
Right.
I might have had an insight in that angels or seraphim had wings for a purpose because that's how a big part of the way that they travel.
Yeah, maybe.
God doesn't make things without
In
purpose.
Isaiah 6, again, the wings, the purpose there was to cover their face and their feet as a representation of the holiness of God.
Or was that just an application of that purpose?
Oh, yeah.
Wings are,
Who knows?
we can use our feet to walk with, or we could use them to...
Yeah. The only thing out there that I would say that we can't perceive that doesn't have some sort of physical form would be God. Because he existed before matter existed. But I think everything else, if he created it, it has some sort of representation. And that's why for the ancient people, it was like, well, they're like winds, they're like fire. I can't touch the wind, but I know the wind is there and the wind can move. And angels are kind of like that. I can't always see them, I can't always touch them, but they're there and they can affect things.
And they have the ability to be perceived in different forms.
Yes.
Because most of the time they appear as a man, whether it's with Lot when the angels came, and or with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yep. Yeah. So sometimes in the scripture we see them and you can't tell the difference between them and a regular human being, which is a New Testament thing too, because Hebrews.
You can, but not.
Right. Well, Hebrews.
We recognize it right away.
Was it Hebrews 13? Talks about how we may have entertained angels and didn't know it because they can look just like human beings. But sometimes they look like beings of fire, on horses of fire, chariots of fire. Sometimes they look like seraphim. Sometimes they look like the living creatures of Ezekiel and Revelation, and they got 4 faces. And there's a whole, again, there's that whole realm out there that we are not designed to be able to perceive. And that realm, yeah, it's crazy. So, and I think this is all kind of in there. I think that's what's going on here. I think, and again, I changed my mind since we did the Revelation thing, and even now, I think I'm changing my mind a little bit on some of the other historic Lucifer doctrine. But I think where I'm at right now, what we're looking at right here, is we have. I know. Well, it's good that I'm not so set in my ways that I'm still comfortable changing my mind when I learn new things. I think that what we have going on here is, so God, in his creation of the Holy Temple, in his creation of cherubim, there is an order of angelic being or heavenly being that the scripture refers to as seraphim, that when those seraphim are perceived by human beings, the form by which they are perceived is that of a winged serpent, and that we have here a member of this group, Satan, who has now shown up in the garden.
Who's what?
Shown up in the garden to interact with Eve. Now, I think there's a little bit more going on here too, because I think Satan is a very particular seraphim. Because again, we don't have a lot of knowledge of Satan in Scripture. Okay? Most of our understanding of him comes from the New Testament, but he does show up in the Old Testament every once in a while, under the name Satan, and then here as the Nahas. And the question of kind of where he comes from and where he goes and what his role is, there's a lot of information out there that we don't have. But I have talked often about this text in Zechariah chapter 3. And we've read it a million times. I managed to squeeze it in all over the place. But it is a picture of the courtroom of heaven. And God is the judge. And Joshua, who is the high priest at the time, is standing before him. And it says, to Joshua's right hand was Satan. What's interesting is the word Satan in Hebrew means accuser. And in the context of Zechariah chapter 3, it's accuser in the sense of a courtroom. It is the person who stands in the courtroom before the judge and brings the charges. That is a Satan. It's that role that we would look at nowadays as a prosecuting attorney. And I think the reason why this term here is being used to describe this individual is because Satan's role in creation was to bring the charges before God, the judge of the universe. And what we have here in his fall, like the essence of Satan's fall, is where he brings accusation against God. Okay? And I think that's about as far as the Bible goes to actually giving us any sort of indication of Satan's original role. Okay, go ahead, Chris.
Why, when God created everything,
Yeah.
it was very good.
Yeah.
Create before the fall or before.
So why would God need an accuser?
Yeah.
Because God, being omniscient, knew that sin was going to enter the world. And again, this gets into that, okay, I way back a few minutes ago, nobody asked me, but I asked myself, Josh, do you believe that there's other intelligent life out there? I do. And so then the question is, could that intelligent life have fallen? And I think the answer to that is yes. Also, we know that there's angels that are going to fall. You could even make an argument that there was more than one group of angels that fell. I think the potential, we know that the potential for rebellion was built into creation because we know of at least two intelligent beings, classifications of life, according to the way that the Bible classifies life, that rebelled against God. There's angels that did it, and there's humans that did it. And so I think God, because he built that potential for rebellion into creation, I think Satan had a role in that. And it gets into like the question here of, okay, and we'll talk about this more next week because we're going to specifically talk about the fall. Would Adam and Eve had fallen if Satan hadn't brought the temptation? Would they had come up with that idea on their own? Or did they need Satan to introduce to them the idea that God is lying to you? And it gets into this idea of temptation. And we're going to talk about it when we get to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? Because, so, God makes the tree of life, he makes the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And he tells Adam and Eve, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So Adam and Eve, in their initial creation, did they have the knowledge of good and evil? No. That's the point of the tree. Now, does God have knowledge of good and evil? Yes. Because that's the whole point of the fall, is that God does, you guys don't. God made you guys in ignorance because he doesn't want you to be like him. And God acknowledges the fact that man is now like us. They now have the knowledge of good and evil. But can God tempt people? No. James chapter 1. God cannot tempt people because God himself cannot be tempted. That is James's reasoning. If you cannot experience temptation, if you do not have the ability to be a tempter. So Satan, in his creation, did God create Satan with the ability to experience temptation? Yes, obviously because he fell, and he tempted Adam and Eve. If we're using James's reasoning, the reason why Satan could tempt is because Satan could be tempted. God created Satan with the potential to be tempted and rebel. Why? And I think because Satan had to know the difference between good and evil. Satan had to have that potential for temptation because he was supposed to be the accuser. And he couldn't bring accusation against others before God if he didn't know about rebellion. But it was that potential that was in him that led him to be tempted. And then, even though Adam and Eve didn't have knowledge of good and evil, he was able to bring temptation to them. And now I am just reaming off speculations about things that the Bible doesn't talk about, but it just kind of hints at. And it's that whole, like, why would God make Satan? And I think it's because of God's nature as the judge. And since he's just, there had to be an accuser. But the accuser had to have a knowledge of good and evil, which meant that that accuser had the potential to be tempted and then could then bring temptation. And there's something going on here. Anyway, I don't think Adam and Eve would have fallen if Satan hadn't given them the option. Because they didn't have the knowledge of good and evil. All they knew was to do what God told them. But we'll talk about this next week when we talk about the fall.
But we can certainly sin without his help.
Right, because Adam sinned, and we are now born with the sin nature, and we'll talk. That's going to be really, because I'm going to try to talk about, were Adam and Eve the first humans, and were they historical? And I think the fall demands that they are so. So anyway, this is about all the speculation I want to make about Satan and what's going on here with the serpent. But to answer the question, did Satan possess a serpent? I don't think so. And did Satan take the form of a serpent? No, I don't think so. I think Satan's natural form was that of a winged serpent because he was a seraphim. And now he is here in the garden. And the reason why Eve didn't have a problem talking to a talking snake is because she knew about seraphim. And she's like, oh, this is a seraphim. I'm just talking to an angelic being.
So how would you explain the change of the curse upon him?
We're going to get to the curse. Yeah, we're going to get to the curse. Yeah, and we'll do that probably. We'll get into that next week. But I want to talk about the nature of the fall and what the fall really represents and what's going on here. And I think the essence of the fall is now, and I think Satan's fall, I think what we're looking at here is not just the fall of man. I think we're also looking at Satan's fall. And I think this is where Satan left his proper role of standing before the judge of the universe and bringing accusation forward before him for his holy, righteous judgment. And instead, he shows up here between Adam and Eve, and he brings accusation against God. Because what is going to happen here, Satan is going to accuse God of wrong. Satan is going to accuse God of lying to Adam and Eve. Instead of bringing accusation before God, the accuser is going to accuse God. And in response to that, Adam and Eve are going to make the decision to, the decision they thought that they were making was to become God, and the decision they were actually making was to follow the serpent in rebellion. And we'll talk a little about that. We'll put it in context of the kingdom. Okay, real quick, Becky, and then you're going to have to close this in prayer.
Yeah, this makes way more sense why Eve wouldn't have been freaked out by a talking snake if she had known about angels and had seen them, because they were walking with
Yeah.
God. It makes way more sense.
I think Eve perceiving this as a seraphim is a more reasonable explanation of Eve not being around long enough to know that snakes don't talk, which is often the humorous quip that was given. And, well, didn't Eve think it was weird that angels were talking? Well, she'd only been around for a couple hours. She was ignorant. It does. Yeah. So anyway, and again, this is all that stuff. You got to take all this with a grain of salt. There's a lot of stuff out there. You can go read papers and watch videos and that kind of stuff. But I found it to be interesting, and I think there's some connections. And when we finally get to angelology, we'll come back and we'll revisit some of this stuff. But I think for me, one of the big, I think an important perception of the world that people have to move through is the only thing that's supernatural is God. Everything else is created by God. Everything else is under God's sovereignty. Everything else is ordained by God, is put here for a purpose by God, has its role. And everything else is subject to the will of God. Even the Nahas. When we get to Job, that'll be a really big part of that. And so we don't need to be scared by the stuff that's out there. The only thing that should inspire fear in the life of a Christian is God. Because he is the only thing that's beyond everything else. And he is the only thing that's awesome and terrifying. The Nahas, I'm sure he was impressive to look at, but he's just another thing created by God. And he gets lowered, we'll look at the curse, because he didn't stay where he was supposed to be in his creation, original ordination by God. Satan, instead of staying where he was supposed to be in creation, took matters into his own hands, and because of that, we're going to look at the curse, and he's going to be humbled and brought low. All right, Becky, close us in prayer, please.